But here's the uncomfortable truth. For the aging brain specifically, a 16-8 fast may be doing no more than a regular diet does. So what if the worst thing you could do for your brain is eat something? I know, it sounds completely backwards. I actually started asking this question on a morning I wasn't planning to eat anything. I'd been fasting overnight longer than usual. I'm sitting at my desk, it's around hour 18, and I remember thinking I should feel foggy right now. My blood sugar was on the lower end, I hadn't eaten. By every rule that we've ever been told about brain energy, I should have been struggling. Instead, I was sharp, clearer than I'd been in days. I remember sitting there thinking, that doesn't make sense. And that one moment a while back sent me down the rabbit hole of research. You see, your brain is the most energy hungry organ in your body. It's only about 2% of your body weight, but it burns through roughly 20% of your energy every single day. So the advice has always been the same thing. Feed it, keep your blood sugar stable, never skip breakfast, and this will protect the brain from energy deprivation. Kind of obvious, right? Well, not so much, because researchers have been studying this for nearly 70 years. They've done dozens of studies, thousands of participants, and the findings that kept coming up weren't that most people would expect. The fasted brain didn't struggle in these studies. It performed just as well as the fed brain. That alone dismantles the never skip breakfast narrative completely. But here's what actually caught my attention. Fasted participants sometimes perform slightly better on neurocognitive tests, and longer fasts showed a smaller performance gap, which pointed directly towards something the researchers themselves had flagged: the metabolic switch to ketones. So the question I'd been sitting with finally had some data behind it. If the brain runs on glucose and fasting depletes glucose, why would the fasted brain hold up that well or perform better? That's another question there. The answer goes deeper than most fasting content ever gets. And I want to walk you through what the research is actually showing, what's happening inside the brain during fasting, the backup fuel system most people never activate, and what fasting window actually starts triggering these changes and which ones don't. You see, for most of our lives, our brains have ran on glucose, at least until something happens and it just doesn't anymore. Aging brains show a consistent pattern, especially in mild cognitive impairment and early Alzheimer's. Something called cerebral glucose hypometabolism. Complicated phrase, simple problem. The brain starts struggling to pull glucose inside a neuron in the brain. Not because there isn't enough glucose in the blood, because in the studies, blood glucose in many of the participants looked completely normal. So the fuel is actually there. The brain just couldn't access it the way it used to. So that's the problem. And this is the part that had been there for years before it started actually getting the attention it deserved. The answer kept pointing back to insulin resistance, not in the muscles, not in your liver, inside the neurons themselves in the brain. The same mechanism driving type 2 diabetes appears to be silently happening inside the aging brain, sometimes decades before any cognitive symptoms appear. Some researchers have started calling Alzheimer's type 3 diabetes, not because the conditions are identical, but because the insulin signaling breakdown appears to be a shared thread. And if you look at this as a fuel access problem, not just a fuel supply problem, that brings us to a different question entirely. It's not whether the brain is getting enough glucose, it's whether it can actually still use the glucose it's getting. And if it can't, is there another way in? That's where fasting becomes a more interesting conversation than most people realize. Because when you fast long enough, somewhere in that 12 to 18-hour window, something shifts. Insulin levels drop. Liver glycogen starts running low, and the liver begins converting fatty acids into molecules called ketone bodies. These ketone bodies are fuel for the brain. And even in aging brains that are insulin resistant, where glucose can't enter the neurons, ketone uptake often remains relatively intact. So while the main glucose-dependent door is getting harder to open, ketones appear to use a different entrance entirely. A 2022 paper published in Nutrients examining intermittent fasting and brain metabolism put it this way: ketones may represent an alternative energy that bypasses the insulin signaling problem seen in cognitive aging brains. Now, I want to be clear here. This does not mean fasting reverses Alzheimer's. Human clinical evidence is still developing on all this, and I'm not going to overstate what the research actually shows. But mechanistically, if the brain's primary fuel pathway is compromised with age, it looks like fasting activates a secondary pathway that sidesteps that compromise. That's a significant finding, and there's more the research confirmed beyond the fuel side of things. Fasting doesn't just change what the brain runs on. Fasting appears to change how the brain is built. There's a molecule called BDNF, brain-derived neurotrophic factor. A lot of people have heard of it when it comes to the supplement lion's mane. Think of it as fertilizer for your neurons. It supports the survival of brain cells, strengthens connections between them, and plays a central role in learning, memory, and your brain's ability to rewire and repair itself over time. And BDNF levels consistently decline with age. In a review examining 82 peer-reviewed papers, they found that aging-related loss of BDNF is actually associated with reduced synaptic plasticity, impaired memory and learning, and increased risk of cognitive decline. So BDNF drops, the brain becomes less flexible, less adaptable, and fasting appears to upregulate BDNF signaling in multiple brain regions. And there's one more piece the research kept pointing to. The aging brain isn't just dealing with a fuel access problem, it's also dealing with inflammation, chronic low-grade neural inflammation that is increasingly seen as one of the central drivers of cognitive decline. It works through immune cells in the brain called Microglia. Under healthy conditions, they clean up debris and they actually protect neurons. But under chronic metabolic stress, they become overactivated, causing the brain to get stuck in a low-grade inflammatory state that slowly degrades brain tissue over time. A 2024 study published in Nutrients found that fasting reduced neural inflammation by downregulating two key inflammatory proteins, and turning down those proteins correlated directly with improving cognitive performance and memory. To be clear, this was in mice, not humans, but when you pull all this together, ketones bypassing the broken glucose pathway, BDNF supporting neuroplasticity, and with neuroinflammation coming down, fasting appears to shift the brain into fundamentally different operating modes, one that touches most of the major pathways involved with how the brain actually ages. So, big question here. How long do you actually need to fast to start seeing any of this happen? First, let's look at the two camps online that both get this wrong. One camp says any fast is transformative. Do 16-8, change your life. The other says you need multiple day water fasts or nothing meaningful happens. But both are probably overstating things. What the research shows is that for most people, somewhere around the 12 to 16 hour mark is where insulin begins dropping significantly, liver glycogen starts depleting, and ketone production begins gradually increasing. And this is why 16-8 became so popular. For many people, it's long enough to start triggering the shifts while still being realistic enough to sustain. But here's the uncomfortable truth. For the aging brain specifically, a 16-8 fast may be doing no more than a regular diet does. You're still running on the same compromised glucose pathway. The backup fuel system never really comes back online. The insulin resistance that you might have in your neurons is still there, and the brain is still aging on compromised fuel, just with a smaller eating window. But there is some research suggesting that the 18 to 20 hour window may amplify the effects even further in some people. That's where the ketone switch appears to actually deepen and switch on more, where the fuel shift becomes more meaningful for the brain specifically. But consistency probably matters really more than chasing that optimal window. You can apply this by sometimes stretching if you're comfortable with a 16-8, sometimes to an 18-hour window. Because the goal isn't just making ketones for a few hours. It's teaching the body to be more metabolically flexible, helping it to remember how to transition between different fuel sources. Now, before we finish, there are a few important caveats we need to get into here first. People on glucose-lowering medications need to be careful and cautious before attempting extended fasts. People with a history of eating disorders should approach this very carefully. And pregnant women, I shouldn't have to say this, but pregnant women never fast. And sometimes more is not automatically better. Excessive fasting can actually increase cortisol, disrupt sleep, and become its own form of chronic stress. This is not a one-size-fits-all. Don't get me wrong. This is information I'm delivering to you guys, the research. So fasting may be one tool that addresses insulin resistance in the brain directly. It may help teach the brain to activate a backup fuel system for energy and support the pathways that keep it adaptable, as well as reduce inflammation that could quietly work against your brain over time. Fasting done right may be one of the only tools that slows the aging down in the brain. What do you think? Drop a comment. Have you noticed a difference in mental clarity when you fast? What did you actually experience? The community really, I believe, benefits from all of your experiences. So definitely drop your comments down there. This is David. Stay curious, keep experimenting, and keep listening to your own body. And I'll see you guys in the next one.